Today I'm about 35 miles north of Atlanta, and I'm in a city called Cumming, Georgia. It's part of Forsyth County. Today I'm going to be talking about a fascinating story. In fact, both of my next two videos are kind of somewhat related when it comes to what happened in the story. Plus, they both happened relatively close together, too. The next one I'm going to tell, it has a lot more detail and there's a lot more information, so I'm going to head down there tomorrow to do that one. This story today is crazy on its own because back in 2014, a man named Dennis Marx, he attempted to enter into the courthouse building right here behind me. He was decked out with body armor on. He was wearing a gas mask. He had homemade grenades strapped to his vest. Plus, he was armed with an AR-15. Today, we're going to talk about the series of events that went down on that dark day here in Cumming, Georgia. Plus, we're going to get into Dennis Marx's motives for causing chaos at the courthouse. I'm sure that a lot of you who are watching this video right now, you've seen the videos online and you've heard about these people who call themselves sovereign citizens. There's actually one guy right now who's very publicly on trial who is part of the sovereign citizens movement. He tells the court when they address him that he doesn't recognize that name, and when he's referring to himself, he says that he is acting as the representative of Darrell Brooks, even though he is and was born Darrell Brooks.
Good morning, sir. Please state your name for the record.
I'm here as a third-party intervener in that matter, appearing as authorized representative for my client, and I do not consent to or agree to being called that name, Your Honor.
All right, the record should reflect that the individual known to this court as Darrell Brooks is appearing in person in custody.
It sounds so silly to any normal person. This Darrell Brooks guy that's on trial, he was the guy who drove his car through the Christmas parade up in Waukesha, Wisconsin. He's on trial right now. He killed 6 people and severely injured 62 others that day. And his trial, it's been all over the internet the last couple of weeks for all of his crazy antics and the sovereign citizen stuff.
Sir, many of your questions go to these sovereign ideas that are frivolous arguments about the plaintiff and all of that. We give you a little bit of leeway. I give you a little bit of leeway on it. That's
not the topic of today's video. But I mention all that because Dennis Marx, the guy who is the topic of this video today, he also claimed to be a sovereign citizen after he got in trouble with law enforcement. Dennis Marx grew up living a somewhat normal life. He started working at the age of 16 while he was still in school, and he even started saving up his money from the very first job he had all the way up to the rest of his life. Dennis's family, they didn't care for banks. They thought like financial institutions were scams and a way to take money from you. So they kept all of their money in cash, hidden inside of their home. Very early on in life, his parents became what we would call now as doomsday preppers. So they always saved food and water, and they kept an underground cellar fully stocked with legally purchased firearms and things like that, preparing for the end of the world. With all that going on behind the scenes, though, Dennis Marx, he was able to hold down a normal job, and he kept all of the doomsday prepping stuff, he kept all that part of his life a secret. In 2001, right after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the government developed what is called the Transportation Security Administration, or the TSA. Shortly after its inception, Dennis Marx actually got hired on as a TSA agent at Atlanta International Airport, and he would keep that job all the way up until 2008. Back in 2008, Dennis would reveal to his mother that he had been molested as a young child by a family friend. So Dennis's mother, obviously in shock, she recommends that he goes to a therapist, and Dennis went. And this therapist put Dennis on some psychotropic drugs, which changed Dennis mentally, and this actually seems like it's the beginning of this downfall spiral that he would go through. It started right after he got put on these drugs by the therapist. They changed Dennis's mindset so much that it wound up costing him his job as a TSA screener. After that, in 2011, law enforcement received a tip that said that Dennis Marx was growing cannabis on his property. The report said that not only was he growing it, but he was also manufacturing it, like drying it, breaking it up, and all that good stuff. And it also accused Dennis of selling it. The tipster obviously told law enforcement that there was a notable amount of cannabis coming from Dennis's property, because no time after that report came in, law enforcement put Dennis under surveillance. Sometime in early 2011, law enforcement set up a few control buys with undercover detectives, and sure enough, Dennis Marx sold these undercover detectives large amounts of cannabis. So in August of 2011, based off all the evidence that they had collected, authorities raided Dennis's property. They seized over 24 firearms with over 71 clips of ammo. They seized massive amounts of marijuana, and they seized all of Dennis Marx's cash that he had been saving since he was 16 years old. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars here. Like I told you earlier, Dennis and his family, they were doomsday preppers. So even though law enforcement raided his home and they raided his underground bunker, they didn't know that Dennis actually had another secret room that was hidden on his property, that it was completely hidden, that contained more weapons. So although they thought they had taken all of his weapons and drugs and money, they didn't. Dennis was extremely upset over the police coming onto his property and taking his guns and his entire life savings. He took that police raid very personally, and he told everyone that he knew that it was a personal attack against him. He swore that he would get payback against the government for doing this. Initially, Dennis went about things the right way, I guess you could say. He filed lawsuits against the Forsyth County Sheriff's Department, claiming that they violated his constitutional rights and that they used excessive force. Dennis said in his complaint that officers punched him while he was standing with his hands up. I guess they threw either a smoke grenade or a flashbang into his home, because in the complaint he said that they used chemical agents against him, and he said that they put the handcuffs on his wrist so tight that it cut off the circulation to his hands. This lawsuit went on for a long time. He attempted to get all of his money and his weapons back through the court system, but if you live in the United States, you know that these things don't go quickly. If you file a lawsuit, it could take many, many years before it even gets in front of a judge at all. And this also irritated Dennis Marx even more. He wanted his guns and his money back right now, not years from now, and they just wouldn't move quick enough for him. In 2013, 2 years after the raid on his home, things would escalate in a big way. I can't find a lot of information out there as to what caused it, but Dennis Marx's home, it somehow caught on fire with his sister inside of it. Dennis and his sister were very, very close, and she would be found in the burnt rubble of his home. She had been killed by this fire. Initially, the fire department and law enforcement, they questioned Dennis. They were trying to uncover how the fire got started, and they were questioning him as if he had started it. But the whole time, Dennis kept claiming that the local law enforcement started the fire and killed his sister to get back at him for him filing the lawsuit against them. Now, no charges were ever brought up against Dennis or anyone else in this case for starting that fire. And like I said, I can't find a lot of information out there in the paperwork to tell me if they ever even figured out what caused the fire to start at all. But Dennis wholeheartedly believed that the local law enforcement killed his sister and burnt down his home. Dennis was forced to find another place to live after all of this. At the same time, he was severely grieving the loss of his sister. And it was shortly after this incident, the fire and the death of his sister, that Dennis Marx began planning his assault on the Forsyth County Courthouse. Over the years, as doomsday preppers, through books and online materials, not only did Dennis learn how to make his own bullets for his firearms, but he also learned how to make homemade grenades and homemade bombs, or IUDs. Dennis would spend the end of 2013 and the first few months of 2014 making a plethora of homemade bombs and grenades, and he made box after box after box of bullets for each of the firearms that he still had in his possession. By the time he had finished making all of this, and it took him about 8 months, his home was completely covered with these items. He had boxes of these items stacked and piled up in every room of his house. On Friday, June the 6th of 2014, at about 8 a.m., Dennis Marx, he's at his new home right here, and he is loading up all of his firearms and ammunition that he has left. He's loading it all up into his vehicle, and he's preparing to go downtown to assault the courthouse in retaliation for what he believed was the law enforcement killing his sister. The thing is that Dennis has a trial date the following Monday on June the 9th for the charges stemming from the raid on his property back in 2011. He had a court date for 11 felony counts for the manufacturing, the possession of, and the sale of illicit drugs, including marijuana. Dennis planned the assault on the courthouse on this Friday, June the 6th, because he suspected that they were going to lock him up forever the following Monday, meaning to him this Friday was the last day the courthouse was going to be open prior to that for him to get his revenge. So that Friday, June 6th, early in the morning, he's at home and he's loading his .45 caliber handgun with bullets. Just before he goes to put that .45 caliber in its holster, he pulls the slide back to begin chambering a round in the barrel, and the gun accidentally goes off, firing a round. Dennis Marx had just shot himself. The bullet went through his upper thigh and came out his leg just above his knee. I mean, I'm just saying, it had to have hurt like hell. Now, Dennis, he knew that he wasn't going to be able to go to the hospital. If he did, law enforcement would be called, and he probably would have to stay in the hospital for a few days. Monday would come, and he believed that they were going to come get him from the hospital, bring him here to the courthouse, and force him to stand trial. So he decides that he's going to stop loading his car. He actually leaves behind several firearms and a backpack full of live grenades. He hops in his car. He wants to make sure that he gets to the courthouse and completes his mission before he passes out from losing too much blood. So he hops in his Nissan SUV and he starts driving here towards the courthouse. I'm here in the downtown area where the events that we're about to talk about all took place. The courthouse there still looks exactly the same as it did in 2014 when all of it went down. The only thing different is in some of the video clips and all that from that day, you can see that they are actually building this building at the time. This is now the Forsyth County Courthouse, and the building that was the courthouse back then is now the courthouse annex. Everything looks exactly the same. Now Dennis, he drove his silver Nissan right up the road, coming from this way, right up in front of the courthouse here. As he drove through that intersection right there, he tosses out some homemade spike strips that he made onto the ground. He's expecting a police response, and he's figuring that this is going to slow him down. So he tosses out the homemade spike strips on the road right there, and he pulls his car up right here in front of the courthouse. It's at this point he gets out and he walks down to this side of the intersection where he throws out some more homemade spike strips. That way both sides of the road are covered in front of the courthouse, expecting, like I said, to slow down any police response. It could have been much different back in 2014, but this road here, it's a wonder that he was able to block off any area, because this road is super busy. There's not been a lull in traffic the entire time I've been here filming. in this courthouse square area. It's wild. It's crazy to think. It's crazy to think that he actually was able to throw spike strips out and block this whole area off that morning. Maybe it was different back in 2014. I don't know. Now, while Dennis was out here and he was tossing out these spike strips, a sheriff's deputy who was working the courthouse detail, he was working inside of that building there, he happened to notice Dennis out here looking suspicious. He saw Dennis outside out here wearing body armor, and it obviously threw up some red flags. So he immediately calls it in over his radio, and he comes outside to confront Dennis and see what's going on. Once Dennis Marx sees the deputy coming towards him, Dennis picks up his AR-15 and he fires a few rounds in the deputy's direction, and then he ran back around his SUV to take cover. During that exchange, that deputy was hit in his leg twice. He went down to the ground, but he was still able to draw his firearm, and he started shooting back at Dennis, who at this point was back in his vehicle. So the deputy's bullets went through the windshield. They did not strike Dennis. So the deputy, he starts crawling back towards the building. Dennis, he notices this, so he puts his SUV into drive and he starts driving towards the deputy in an attempt to run him over. And that is when Dennis's SUV it crashes into the side railing right out here in front of the courthouse, and you can see his SUV right over here near this fence. That's when his SUV got stopped there. At the same time, the deputy, he's still firing shots into the windshield of Dennis's SUV, and this actually saved the deputy's life, because although he did not strike Dennis at all with any bullets, Dennis feared that he would be hit, so he stopped. Dennis, instead of backing up and moving it, he just got out. By this time, Dennis suspected that this deputy had called for backup. So he actually dons a gas mask and he throws out several homemade smoke bombs that he had manufactured. And Dennis figured that this would buy him some time and no one would be able to see him, so that he could slip into the courthouse to cause more havoc. But again, these grenades were made by Dennis at home in his kitchen, not by a professional company. So needless to say, these smoke grenades weren't quite as good as a real smoke grenade. So after Dennis threw several of these homemade grenades out, the smoke filled the air here in front of the courthouse for just a few moments, but it very quickly dissipated. What Dennis did not know is the day that he had decided to do this, the day he has decided to assault the courthouse, just across the street right here at the Forsyth County Jail, the Forsyth County Sheriff's Department SWAT team, they were all together training for, coincidentally, an active shooter situation. And it was just luck on the city's behalf that they were having this active shooter drill the morning that this all happened. So unfortunately for Dennis, typically when SWAT team gets called in, they're scattered out all over a city. They all have to come into a central police station from all over, and then they suit up in their SWAT gear, and then they get deployed to a scene, and it takes a little while. But on this morning, they were already all together. They were just right next door to the courthouse. They were all suited up and they were ready to go. So by the time Dennis had this encounter with the sheriff's deputy out front of the building here, the first thing that the deputy did, like I said, he called for backup and he gave them a brief description of what he saw. There's a man out front in body armor with an assault rifle. So obviously that's a situation the SWAT team was immediately notified. They're over here just right across the street. They can't believe it either that this is happening right outside from where they are. And by the time Dennis throws those smoke grenades out, these SWAT guys are already on the move. At the time, this was all a construction area. They managed to sneak across from the county jail over into this area. where all the construction was going on. And then when Dennis threw those smoke grenades out, it actually played to his detriment, because the SWAT team, they were already moving in, and the smoke allowed those SWAT team members to actually get closer to him without him being able to see them. And then as the smoke dissipated, 8 SWAT team members who were all working in coordination with each other, they all opened fire on Dennis Marx. By the time the smoke settled, Dennis Marx was laying on the ground right out here in front of the courthouse. He was deceased. He had been hit with 7 gunshot wounds to his chest and 5 gunshot wounds to his head in an organized precision strike from the Forsyth County SWAT team. The whole attack on the courthouse lasted about 3 minutes. That's from the time Dennis pulled up out front here until the moment the SWAT team members stopped firing their weapons and Dennis was dead. Now, after the fact, we learned that it appeared as if Dennis was planning on entering into the courthouse and taking hostages. On top of the body armor he had and the gas mask, Dennis also had dozens of zip ties that were made into like the temporary handcuffs that some law enforcement uses. He also had on a backpack that was filled with a handful of homemade bombs, and it had a handful of homemade grenades in it. So law enforcement believed that he was planning on taking hostages, and then he was planning on distributing those bombs and grenades throughout the courthouse building in an attempt to level it with everyone inside. Immediately following the attack on the courthouse here, knowing that Dennis was carrying bombs and grenades, law enforcement quickly got the necessary warrants that they needed, and they came over here to his residence. First off, once they arrived here at Dennis's home, they had to navigate to his house fearing for booby traps. All the way around the home, Dennis had dug up little small pits, and down in those pits he had erected some like sticks with sharp ends on them sticking up. Then he covered them up with a thin layer of grass and leaves to blend in with the ground. So if you were to like step on one not knowing, you would quickly fall into the little hole and those sticks would impale you. Once they figured out where all of these pits were, the bomb squad was sent in to disable and remove all of any homemade bombs or grenades that were left in the home. While inside, they were able to discover all of Dennis's notes and his thoughts that he had written down while planning this attack, which is why we know a lot of the information that we know about his time leading up to the attack. After everything was all said and done, the deputy here at the courthouse who first encountered Dennis Marx, Deputy Sheriff James Rush, he was a 23-year veteran of the Forsyth County Sheriff's Department. He was praised as a hero. Dennis Marx never made it into the courthouse that morning, and the sheriff himself gave a press conference and said that had Deputy Rush not delayed Dennis Marx out front of the courthouse, there's no doubt that he would have made it inside, and there could have been a great loss of life that morning. The sheriff said that every moment counted, and Deputy Rush delaying him outside gave the SWAT team time to get into position and take their shots. 8 years later, in present day, there's not a lot left behind from this whole ordeal. In 8 years, they've just about repaired all of it. On top of that, they finished construction of the new courthouse building across the street. Well, almost finished. Looks like they still got a little bit going on over here. Right here is where all of it went down. He threw the spike strips out on the road right here, and down here at this intersection, and he wound up getting into his Nissan And driving up here, his vehicle wound up coming to a stop right here. And all of the news footage and any footage that's available from that day, you can clearly make out the black railing coming back behind the white pillar there. So
police say the shooting began at 10 o'clock this morning when 48-year-old Dennis Marx drove his SUV to the steps of the county courthouse in Cumming, Georgia.
This is the spot right here where that went down. You can actually see a few areas that they have patched and filled in. There's another one right here from bullet holes in the building. This is it right here. This is where that whole thing went down. That is going to do it for this video today from here in Cumming, Georgia. And today's story, Dennis Marx and the assault on the courthouse here in Cumming, Georgia. I want to thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you're new here, go down, hit that subscribe button, then hit that notification bell so you get notified every time I upload a video. If you're interested in supporting the channel, there's links down in the description box below. But you guys watching and hitting the like button, that supports me just fine enough, and I can't thank you all enough for doing that. Thank you all. I will see you again next with another courthouse attack video. This one was much deadlier, and there's a lot more details to the story, which is why I saved it until tomorrow. But until then, please, all of you, stay safe and stay healthy. Much love to all of you.